We're rolling.
Okay.
We're rolling. So just keep the eye, not the camera, just keep the eye level with me.
And you want me speaking to you, obviously, not to the camera.
Exactly. Okay, so today is October 10th,
Yes, it
2018. We are, what's the name of the neighborhood here?
Neighborhood here really is Mid-Wilshire, Beverly.
Beverly, Los Angeles, California. We're with Donnie
Maseng.
And we are, most of this interview is about, we're going to dedicate it to your father.
Yep.
Before we start, I'd like you to introduce yourself to me.
So I'm Donnie, I'm 68 years old. I was born and raised in Israel, mostly in Sahala. But I also lived in Kibbutz Sarid. Started performing in Israel when I was 15 in Shuot Rishonot, and then went on to do a lot of stuff on television and performances in radio, and then moved to the United States in 1976. 76. So, but lived all over the place. New York, Minnesota, California, Florida, back to New York, and here.
Gotcha. We're going to talk about your father. Your father was a fighter pilot.
He was a bomber pilot.
Pilot in the American Air Force.
Yes, World War II.
And then he volunteered to come.
Correct. For the Israeli independence, War of Independence,
yeah. And we're going to talk about him. Let's go back to your father's birth. And
sure.
Can you tell me when he was born, where he was born?
He was born August 6th, 1923, in Illinois, in a place called Mount Prospect, Illinois, right, suburb of Chicago. His parents were Scandinavian. His father was Norwegian. His mother was Danish. His father was an electrical engineer who was brought over, I believe, by GE from Norway. At the time, GE was importing Norwegian engineers. He grew up in the Midwest in a very typical kind of Norwegian Lutheran home. Went to the University of Illinois. Was on the track team there, and then World War II broke out. He volunteered, went to the Air Force. When he finished his basic training, he was assigned to B-26s, which were considered the single most dangerous plane to fly, simply because a lot of young pilots got killed. They crashed the plane, either in takeoff or in landing. It had a very low tolerance for bad flying, and you had to land it at really high speeds for those days, which was kind of unusual. He went through World War II. He was in Sardinia, bombing the German installations on the Arno River and on the River Po. Came out without a scratch. Nobody from his squadron was injured, was ever hurt. They never lost a plane.
Should we stop for a second?
Yeah.
Okay. So your father was stationed in Sardinia.
In Sardinia, for the first part of it, and then when Germany surrendered, they moved to Okinawa. So he flew out of Okinawa. When the war was over, he went back to the United States. He really wanted to be a poet, and so he studied creative writing at Columbia University in New York.
Okay.
And then one day, on the Upper West Side, while he was eating breakfast in a diner, this gentleman approached him, told him that he was from the Israeli underground, from the Haganah, and that his name was on a list, that they wanted him as a pilot. And my father said, "How'd my name get on your list?" He said, "Well, you're, as somebody who seems to be the kind of person who would help the Jews." And my father said, I don't really know any Jews. I don't have any Jewish friends. Never, by the way, till the day he died, never knew how he got on that list. He had no idea.
He's just in a diner on the Upper West Side, near Columbia.
Yeah, and somebody comes in.
Some guy just walks in and says,
You. And my father, he's talking to my father, And my father said to him, I'm assuming you're asking me to volunteer. And he said, I am. And he said, when were you thinking of that? And he said, we were hoping tonight. And my father said, well, he said, I have one question. I'm Norwegian, he said, and so fly fishing for me is really vital. I really have to have good fly fishing. Is there good fly fishing in Israel? And the Israeli said to him, the best.
The best. Number one.
Nowhere better. And so my father volunteered. I think they flew.
And he had no idea who this guy was?
No, never met him before. But he flew out of Teterboro, I think, with C-46s, and then flew, I think, to Long Beach, California, where he helped train Jewish pilots.
Okay, so he flies. He leaves.
He just leaves Columbia University.
Is he a religious guy? Your father? No.
Not a religious bone in his body. Nothing. Really not. No messianism. None of that. There's no the Jews are the chosen people. None of it. The only other explanation that I'd heard from him was that he was too...
Your father's first name?
My father's first name was Trygve Johannes. Trig.
Very Jewish.
Very Jewish name, right? When he converted, he became Hanan ben Avraham, but nobody ever called him Hanan.
So how do you pronounce his first name?
Trygve.
Very, very Norwegian.
Very Norwegian, yeah. Yes, extremely Norwegian.
So he flies to Long Beach?
So he flies to Long Beach, California. He helps train some Jewish American pilots on the C-46. Then they flew them down, I think, to Mexico City. I think they flew them some of them went through Brazil, some of them went through the Azores, some of them went through Canary Island. But they end up in Italy and then Eretz Israel, and then he does Velveta Echad, Mifta Velveta. That's bringing the Messerschmitt parts in the C-46s from Czechoslovakia to Israel. And that was how he arrived. He never looked back again. He never wavered at all. I mean, from the day he arrived in Israel, that was his country, that was his home. He met my mother, who was a daughter of a rabbi and from a Hasidic family on my grandfather's side, and converted to Judaism by Rav Unterman, the Rav Rashi of Tel Aviv, and that was it. He lived and died in Israel. Quite extraordinary.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, do you know when he arrived in Israel, roughly?
48, but I don't know exactly when in 48. I don't remember if it was in the winter or is it in the spring, but at the very beginning.
At the beginning of 48.
At the very beginning of the war.
Of the war.
Right.
Okay. And
they recruited him before the war. I know it's before the war broke out. Because part of what they said was, there's going to be a war, and he said, why? And they said, well, there's 40 million of them and 600,000 of us. And my father said, this is a true quote, I have always abhorred asymmetry. And that was the reason he gave as to why he came. He did not like asymmetry. So...
He is not a fighter pilot, he's actually a pilot,
bomber
pilot, to use him in the war independence as more cargo.
As more tovala, right?
Tovala.
Yeah, right. Because it was on DC-3s and C-46s and that stuff.
Yeah, those are big planes.
Yeah,
those are big planes. Yeah. And he is participating in Operation. What did you call it?
Velveta. Yeah, Velveta Echad, I think, and Velveta Shnaim, I think.
Did he ever talk to you about that, or?
Yeah, not much. He wasn't big on talking about war, unless he, was late at night. He never liked talking much about himself. That wasn't his thing. He flew, he did stuff. Clearly, the war wasn't for him anything as scary as what World War II was, which was like hellacious when they were bombing the anti-aircraft. He didn't experience that so much in the War of Independence. So it was a very different story. For him, it was a fascinating, as he said to me once, he said, Sonny boy, how many people do you know who can say they actually helped create a new country? And he said, so for him, that was the big thing was that, oh my God, here I am and I'm a vital part of this happening. That was the thing for him. And he thought Israelis were strange and crazy and difficult, and they thought he was strange and crazy and difficult in very, very different ways.
Did he ever talk to you about what his family thought about him going to Israel?
There's ambivalence. I mean, his brother Leif, who's still alive and lives in Columbia, South Carolina, was a war hero in World War II. He was in the paratroopers in Battle of the Bulge. Leif, I know, was very proud of him. My grandfather, I know, was very proud of my father, really proud of him. My grandmother was ambivalent about it. She was quite a bit anti-Semitic, and so the idea of her son flying for the Jews, and certainly marrying a Jew and becoming one was difficult for her.
Really?
Yeah, for her. My grandfather, not a trace of that, but my grandmother, yeah, a bit. So it was odd, but for the most part, like my cousins, Mari and Nancy and Lisa, I mean, those were all very proud and very, he was a hero. He did stuff. He really put his life on the line. And when I think about it, the idea, sure that Jews should volunteer and go to fight for if something catastrophic happens, I'm on the next plane. That's not, but that's obvious. But why would a Norwegian, from a very, very old Norwegian family, like we're talking 1,400-year-old Norwegian family, so that's the extraordinary thing, that he would have thought to just drop everything and just go. And then that's it. Israel became his country. He knew it like the back of his hand.
Wow, it's very, very rare.
It is.
Very rare.
Yeah.
There was another gentleman who I've been hearing about from different people who were in Machal.
Mm-hmm. That's what my father was part of Machal, right?
Yeah. Whose name was Jesse Slade.
Jesse Slade.
He was a Navajo Indian.
Yeah, I didn't know Jesse. I knew quite a few of the others. I remember.
He died in 1951.
Okay. So that
Yeah.
would explain it.
And he was he was in the American Army in the Second World War, and his officer was Jewish. And after the war, he kept in contact with the officer, and this guy said to him, "I'm going to volunteer in the war," and he came with him.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And he was a Navajo Indian, I think, from Arizona or.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a few stories that are very, very interesting and very. So once your father gets to Israel, he's living in Tel Aviv, probably. Mm-hmm. They put him in a hotel, I think, in the
Armon Hotel, I think, was where they were all at. But the base, I think, was in Ekron. I think it was Ekron. Is where it was, if I'm not mistaken. Because I know there were two bases. There was Ramat David where Ezer was, and my father was in Ekron.
Did he know Ezer Weitzman?
Yeah, very well. Yeah, I knew Ezer well. Yeah, yes, absolutely. My father taught Beni Peled. Quite a few of very famous Israeli pilots and chiefs of Air Force were students of Ezer, people that he had. Yes, we did know Ezer well.
And when does he meet your mother?
End of 48, I think, and they fell madly in love and got married, I think, in 49. Not I think, in 1949. I was born in 1950. So I was born, I think, 10 months after they got married.
Wow, and what can you tell me? Well, I want to wrap up just the part of your father.
Sure.
After the War of Independence, what does he do in Israel? He converts to Judaism.
Well, the conversion in and of itself is quite a story, because you can imagine he's 27 years old at the time, and they do a circumcision with no anesthesia, And my father was Norwegian, which meant he could pack in alcohol really well. They gave him some like Manischewitz to drink. And he is famed to have said when he was cut, "Oh, Jesus Christ." So that was the moment of the conversion. And Ezer flew a Spitfire over the hospital, over Asuta, and bombed it with toilet paper for the Brit. So that was the... They used to have a lot of competitions like that where they'd go from different bases would hold parties. Mm-hmm. And so in one of the times when Ezra's Tayeset came over, they stole my father's, he had a really beautiful Norwegian ivory corkscrew, a bottle opener. And so the next time there was a party in Ramat David, they flew over, I think it was a B-17, opened the bomb bay, and they stole the grand piano in Ramat David and put it in the bomb bay and flew it back to Ekron. So those kinds of... Pilot stories, yeah.
Pilot stories.
Yeah.
So when the war ended, what did he do?
So the war ended, he's two things he did. First of all, he became a test pilot for Bedek.
What's Bedek?
Bedek was the forerunner of the Tasiya Avirit.
Did your father know Hugo Maron?
Sure,
yeah. Because I interviewed Hugo.
Hugo was the chief pilot of Rakia. Yeah, Hugo lived near us.
In Tzahala.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know he passed away.
Yes, I do.
I was very fortunate to interview him about 2 or 3 years before he passed away.
Okay.
And my interview was 6 hours with him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Well, he was on the Kinder transport.
Yeah.
His story was very long.
Wow.
But he was quite a man.
Yes.
And I had a few drinks with him after we finished.
Yeah.
But
he was a serious guy. Yeah, sure.
So he worked for Bedek?
So he worked for Bedek as a test pilot and also went to El Al, flying, I think, the first DC-6s, but I'm not sure, but for sure Constellations, that I remember. And then we were transferred to London because in those days you couldn't fly direct from Tel Aviv to New York. No. So there was an El Al crew that would fly Tel Aviv, London, Tel Aviv, and then there'd be a crew flying London, New York, London. So my father was stationed in London, so for 3 years I lived in London as a child. I went to kindergarten there. When we came back, he really did not like being away from home. He was a very private man. He didn't see flying at all as a glamorous thing. He wasn't in love with flying. It was kind of different that way. He was a pilot's pilot. He was a really awesome pilot, but he didn't much like it. It's an interesting thing. It was something that he always believed that it's better approached with a little morsel of fear and distrust, that it would always keep you safer as a pilot. It would keep you more honest that way. So he had no taste for Wild Blue Yonder Boys. He didn't like that. So Arkia for him became like ideal because, leave in the morning, come back in the afternoon. And that was that. And he stayed with Arkia till he...
retired?
Yeah, till he retired.
When did he retire?
He was 61, I don't remember.
Really? He was flying till that age?
He was flying, till 60,
When did your father pass away?
In Tel Aviv.
When?
1999.
1999.
Yeah.
So he worked with Arkia until he retired?
Yeah.
And where do they live? In Tzahala?
Tzahala, that's really where I grew up. Rehov Avner, 4 houses down from Rabin, up on our street, then...
You're talking about when you were a child?
Right.
So Rabin lived down the street?
Rabin, yeah. I went to school with Dalia. And then, in my class. And then around the corner, Dayan. And then Arik Sharon, Motihod. So, that was the neighborhood. Those were the people that I grew up with. That's...
And I'm sure these people like Ezer, who knew your father, had a very tremendous appreciation for...
They did. He was a very legendary character because he was very, very silent for the most part. He hardly ever spoke. Young pilots used to be afraid of him because he was just so silent, and his teaching method was severe and kind of unforgiving in a way. Very Norwegian, very, very cold, everything very rational, no room for sentimentality. No, he was not a chevriman. Did not fit in that way. So they admired him for that, and there was a lot of legends about him, but he also was not close friends with the Israelis. His close friends really were the Machal people, were the Americans, Sam and Ted Gibson and Smokey Simon. I remember those people.
Did you know Al Schwimmer also?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah, all of them. So that whole group, Danny Agronsky, there was a whole group of people who I grew up seeing, and they're very colorful characters. Really, one character after another. All like film kind of characters. Really interesting men. Some of them with very interesting wives. Really interesting people. But he was he always remained an outsider. He always remained not really one of a chevra. Just wasn't. Now, that said, he used to go on he was an amateur archaeologist, so he used to go on digs with Pesach Baradon. He was in the digs for the Bar Kochva Mimtzaim in Yam HaMelech. So he did that. He used to talk to Avram Yofe from Chevra Le'Haganat HaTeva, because my father, when he was flying, would literally map out things of Eretz Israel. He knew the country, Le'oka u'le'rochba u'le'omka. He really loved Israel. And even though he was a totally not religious person, he knew the Bible inside out, and it was tied with him that way also. So he'd always know to show you, to walk you on King David's steps, or here's where Saul died, here's where this happened, here's where that, here's the Battle of Megiddo, there's that attitude that remained. He always remained in love with the land of Israel. Not so much with what the country had become eventually, which was hard for him and for my mother, but the land always, Eretz Israel for him was just, he was incredibly proud of it. He was incredibly connected in a true way, in a really deep way.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. And was his relationship with his family back in the States, was it
very, very remote.
Remote.
Very remote, yeah. We'd come to visit here, and in one of the instances stayed for 2 months with my grandparents, who were at that time living in Louisville, Kentucky. My aunt and uncle were living in Lexington, Kentucky, so we stayed there, and my parents traveled around. But his relationship with his parents was strained, especially with his mother. He was closer with his father, but with his mother was very... there was very much a remote. He literally he was one of those, ger v'toshav anochi, as Avraham Avinu says. He was always a ger. He was always a nochri, be'eretz nochriya. He always felt that way, but wherever he went, he was always the outsider looking in. He was always an observer. And even though clearly he was a participant in that, he put his life on the line, but he was not part of. He was just sitting, just off camera. That's where my father was all the time. Just off camera, just looking at you, just observing you. It's different. He was famous because he used to read all the time while he was flying. He'd do the takeoff stuff. Once everything got checked, autopilot, he'd sit and read books. Of course, the legends were that he'd take off while he was reading and he'd land while he was reading, which is nonsense. And I used to fly with him a lot, so
Did you? Yeah.
Oh yeah, a lot. I flew with him on every airplane that he ever flew, I used to sit in the cockpit. So I know how meticulous he was and how strict he was about protocol and about, flying safely. But he loved reading. And he used to smoke cigarettes with an ivory kind of cigarette holder. So that also added to the... And
to the persona.
And he drank like a Norwegian. So that too was not Israeli.
What was his fancy of a drink? What was he?
Unfortunately, anything really, but wine, beer, and vodka.
Okay.
And so yeah.
And you said that you
and akvavit, obviously, but you couldn't get akvavit in Israel.
And you said that the Machal people were common faces while you were growing up.
Yes. For years. Yeah. I mean, I knew a bunch of them. I remember, I think Sam Feldman, Smokey Simon, I remember well, obviously. Ted Gibson, I know. I didn't remember Ted because he got... Hugo, sure, yeah. Who else was there? There were Stan Hinks, he flew for El Al. Tom Jones flew for El Al. I mean, there were a bunch of them, foreign pilots.
Did you know a guy named Tapperson? Migdal?
The name, yes. Yeah.
South African.
Right, South African, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, lived in Kfar Shmaryahu.
Yep. That's the whole Kfar Shmaryahu gang.
Yeah.
Jerry Ranoff, who was a small plane pilot from Shreveport, Louisiana. He just passed away a couple of years ago. But yeah, a lot of those people, a lot of wonderfully colorful characters.
Nice, very nice. And you said that he just adopted Israel as his home.
Yeah, that was it. It was just where he belonged.
And you spoke what language to him? You spoke English?
English only at home. Yeah. We spoke English at home, Hebrew in the street or in school.
How was his Hebrew?
His Hebrew was fine. He refused to speak it because he was ashamed of his accent. So he would only answer in English.
Okay.
But sometimes people made the mistake of speaking Hebrew near him, and he'd explain to them that he actually understood everything that they said. It's just that, it's like my wife, by the way, speaks perfect Hebrew.
Yeah.
Like reads Haaretz or Mariv, no problem. But she's constantly speaking in English because of the accent.
Because of the accent?
Yeah. So it's,
Now, we're going to shift it now a little and speak about your mother.
Okay.
Even though I just see here by the pictures that this is, we might as well also talk about her and her family.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
So when was your mother born and where was she born?
My mother, let's see, she came to Israel in 1934 and she was 7 years old.
So she was born in 1927.
Right, yes.
Where was she born?
She was born in Atlantic City, and then, because my grandfather was a rabbi in Philadelphia at the time, but they were on summer vacation in Atlantic City. She was born, and then he became the senior rabbi of a congregation in Cleveland, of Cleveland Jewish Center. So they moved to Cleveland, and then 1934, he decided, that's it, we're going to Eretz Yisrael. So my great-grandfather, Shmuel Blum, the Nadvan, started coming in 1917 and purchasing lands all over Eretz Yisrael, and set up a factory for artificial teeth. For that, he had the patent that till today is used for crowns. So my great-grandfather was a verbrannte Zionist. I mean, like, absolutely. He was from Lithuania, dirt poor. I mean, came to America starving.
Probably in the 1880s?
Exactly. Became a peddler in upstate New York, but he was a great tool maker. And he was an inventor. He had a brilliant mind. And he started...
And his name?
His name was Shmuel Blum, Samuel Blum.
Samuel Blum.
Yeah.
And your mother's grandfather.
My mother's grandfather. My grandmother's dad. And he eventually opened his own factory in Philadelphia. Eventually, the family sold out to Warner Lambert. It was Universal Dental Company.
To Palestine from 1917?
From 1917 until he moved there in 1932, something like that. And then the way it worked in my family, my grandmother, I believe, had seven siblings, I believe. Those who stayed in Philadelphia had to support those who go to Eretz Israel. Just that simple. It was just that. So they could have the money, they could have, the positions of power in the company, but the ones who are going to Eretz Israel, those are the pioneers, those are the chalutzim, and you have to support them. And that's kind of how the family operated. So my grandmother was kind of the queen of the family in Israel.
And they moved to Palestine in 1934 with your mother?
Tel Aviv, yeah.
To Tel Aviv.
With my mother and her two siblings, my Aunt Zanny, my Aunt Suzanne, and my Uncle David. My mother was the youngest.
She was the youngest.
Yeah.
And they moved to Tel Aviv?
Yeah.
Where did they settle in Tel Aviv?
I think in Rehov Arnon 11. I still remember, because I remember living in Rehov Arnon 11. I'll tell you something that maybe will be cool for you. There was this lady downstairs who used to be there in the corner. We lived on this corner, on the north corner of Rehov HaYarkon. I don't remember what was the side street that went into HaYarkon Street. So we were on Arnon here, and on this corner, right opposite us, was another house. Those old Bauhaus kind of three-story white buildings. And there was a lady there with her mother. She'd be there every day, and she'd always talk to the kids. We'd all kind of hang around. She spoke to us like we were adults. She spoke to us seriously. Give us candy, and we'd talk. A daily thing. And then I'm in school, I don't remember what, Kita Zayin, Kita Vav, and I read, Leah Goldberg and Yedidai Rehov Arnon, and that was the woman, it was Leah Goldberg, who lived downstairs in the other building. And that's who we used to go and I just thought she was the sweet lady who took such good care of her mother. I remember she used to hold her by the hand or by the arm. Very sweet, very kind. So that's an old childhood memory from this. So Rehov Arnon for sure, but they also lived somewhere else, maybe in Mazeh, I can't remember where, but somewhere around there.
And her father, your grandfather, is a rabbi.
So he comes, he's a rabbi.
And his name?
His name is Harry S. Davidowitz, Shalom Zvi Davidowitz. Now, he started out in Lithuania as a Lubavitcher.
Your grandfather?
Yeah, he was in the Lubavitch Yeshiva in Kovna. He was in Ilui. The guy was awesome. He comes to America when he was 18, really starving to death. He was 5'5", but barrel-chested, because he was so self-conscious of being small and a small Jew. He wanted to be powerful. So when he got accepted into Columbia University, his roommate was Hirohito's brother. And so, Emperor Hirohito's brother. And so his roommate taught him jiu-jitsu and bodybuilding. And so he did that. He got his PhD, but they said to him, Mr. Davidowitz, you're not getting a teaching job here. We already have 3 Jews. So what I suggest, his thesis advisor said to him, you go across the street to the Jewish Theological Seminary and get yourself ordained, and then you'll have, So he did that, and then he went and got a PhD at, I think, Dropsy College or something. So he became a conservative rabbi, and then 34 he comes to Eretz Yisrael. Well, you couldn't be a conservative rabbi in Eretz Yisrael in those days. There was no such thing. Right. And interestingly, when my grandfather came to Eretz Yisrael, took the kippah off his head, I said, I'm home. That's it. Now, I never saw any outward signs of religiosity from my grandfather, who was my angel and the most important person in my life, in growing up. I really owe him everything. He was my teacher, he was my sweetheart, my angel. He just was devoted, never spoke ill of anybody, never a harsh word, knew the Bible. His game he liked to play with me. It's like, open the Bible, don't look, put your finger, read me the word, and then tell me if you want me to go backwards or forwards. And he'd know Bal Peh, forwards and backwards, the entire Bible. After he died, about 2 years after he died in 1973, I'm in the kitchen in their apartment in Tel Aviv. By then they were living in Rehov Pardes, And my grandmother said, "What are you doing?" I said, I'm taking a plate. She said, what are you eating? I don't remember what it was I was eating. She said, "On a milchik plate?" I said, "What, you're kosher?" She said, "What do you think all these dishes are for?" I said, "Guests, Shabbat, No, they were always observant, but he never believed in doing it outwardly. He believed in it as a inyan pnimi. I once said to him, "Saba, you always say that you're a chassid, but you don't look like a chassid." And he said to me, "Tatale, being a chassid is a condition of your soul, not a condition of your wardrobe." So that was his way. Now, so he couldn't be a rabbi. He nominally ran the factory that my great-grandfather did. My grandfather was absolutely, woefully unqualified to run anything. I mean, he was So he started translating Shakespeare. He was the first person to translate all of Shakespeare into Hebrew, all the plays and the sonnets, and then he translated Chaucer, and then translated Beowulf. So that's what he did with his time, really, was became a translator. Loved the Hebrew language. Just adored the Hebrew language, adored the Bible. He adored Eretz Israel, but not in the same way my father did. My father knew Eretz Israel way better than my grandfather. So,
what I wanted to ask you about, there's also a story about your grandfather having something to do with the Declaration of Independence.
This is one of those things, and that's my grandfather's motto always, Yehalelcha zar velo picha, let a stranger extol your virtues, never yourself. And so, when you think about it, I never knew anything impressive about my grandfather from my grandfather. Never. Just never. He told me stories about his childhood and about starving, and mostly Hasidic stories, and mostly we talked Torah. He was teaching me Bible.
Yep. Hold on a second. Okay.
Anything complimentary about him, I learned from my grandmother, not from him. So it's the year 2000. We come back from a concert in New Jersey that I had just done my show, Wasting Time with Harry Davidowitz, which was about my relationship with my grandfather. And we get an email. "Hi, my name is Yoram Shachar. I'm a researcher. I'm doing my doctorate, something I think in Germany, I don't remember where. And my thesis is about Megillat HaAtzmaut, Achrazat HaAtzmaut. And I was wondering if you happen to actually be the grandson of Shalom Zvi Davidowitz. If you are, I have interesting things to talk about." So I wrote back, "Indeed, I am." Well, he then tells me that the only way he even found me, he knew me as a singer in Israel, but my name is Trygve Maseng. Where's the connection to Davidovich? He found because of the show, because of Wasting Time with Harry Davidowitz. He went, who knows, maybe that guy is related. And that's where he starts telling me. First he says, as a researcher, I'm going to first have to ask you questions. I don't want you to tell me anything in advance, and you just answer them. When we're done, then we can talk. So he asked me questions. Did your grandfather ever talk about the Declaration of Independence? I said, per se, no, but my grandparents were friends of the Ben-Gurions, especially my mom. My grandmother was a friend of Paula and of Vera Weitzman, and Henrietta Solkos, my grandmother, was her assistant in Aliyat HaNoar. So yeah, my grandfather loved Ben-Gurion and kind of worshipped him in a way. But no, he never spoke about that. Do you know Tzur Israel as part of the Tefillah before the Amidah? I said, well, duh, of course. He said, no, it's not duh, of course. He said, because not everybody used to do Tzur Israel before the Amidah. I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, so I sang the melody. He said, where do you know it from? It's my grandfather. So why would your grandfather know? I said, well, my grandfather was from Lubavitch. He said, oh. So then we started talking about translating and about this and about what did my grandfather think of America and the American Revolution. And I explained to him at length, my grandfather's utter admiration for the founding fathers and for the Declaration of Independence of the United States and for the Constitution. Well, it turns out, he said, that they know now for sure that the first tiyota, the first draft of the Achazat Atzmo, was written in his library in Rehov Alnon Street, and probably with his help, and they know which sentences he probably wrote. Tzur Israel v'Goal. I mean, that line started with my grandfather. It was afterwards attributed to Ben Gurion, which was incorrect, actually. The reason it even ended up with my grandfather is because it was a secret mission given to this lawyer, Berm, or whatever, whose name was, who lived on Rehov Yarkon, and he was supposed to draft something, look at whatever, look at the American Declaration of Independence, look at something and come up with a draft for us. And he was sitting at dinner at his in-laws and said, you know, I can write the legal stuff, but I don't have any background in Bible or in, you know, that kind of history. And they said, well, you know, Dr. Davidowitz lives right here in the Rehov Alnon 11, go to him. And that's how that happened. And he said, does it surprise you that your grandfather would never have talked about it? I said, not at all. My grandfather didn't talk about anything about himself. It was always my grandmother. My grandmother would always say, he was a genius. And my grandfather would go, hey, you can't believe a word she says. She's crazy in love with me. So that was his attitude. So, yeah, I mean, and you can see from some of the pictures that I showed you that he's pops up at all these big, you know, occasions and everything. You know, Bialik did the hesped for my great-grandfather, for Shmuel Blum, when he died. So there's, it was a fascinating family because you have this intellectual of the highest level, and my grandmother was a brilliant woman, and deeply religious, but in a very mufnam way, in a very internal way, which I think is sorely needed today. When I think about my country, about Israel, and how many times I go back and how I really yearn to be present more in Israel. But what is so sorely needed is that kind of bridge building between the secular world and the religious world, not in a way that is subservient or forgiving or accepting, nothing phony like that, but something real, a connection so that both worlds and both sides can see the utter legitimacy of the other with real respect, with real understanding. And the differences are the differences. I mean, that's, you know, I'm not going to get into that. But my grandfather was a dugma for that. He was a real shining example of a deeply religious person, deeply steeped in mikurot and in everything, but outwardly completely accessible to anyone. No one would ever be hesitant about speaking to him, and anybody who knew him adored him. He was just that kind of a character. My mother was a very fiery,
her name?
Eve. Yeah, Chava Tamal. Fiery, over the top, emotional, dramatic kind of person. She looked a bit like my grandmother, but I don't know where she got her, that part of her.
So she grew up in Tel Aviv, basically.
Yeah, really in Tel Aviv.
Was she involved at all with Gadna, Palma?
Not the Gadna, Haganah a little bit.
A little bit Haganah.
A little bit of Haganah, but then when she met my father, I mean, that was, yeah. My grandmother, though, was a spy for them. So what they did was my grandmother and
grandmother,
my mother's mother.
Your mother's
yeah.
mother. And her name?
Her name was Ida Davidowitz.
So you said that she was a spy for the Haganah?
Yeah, so what they did was they asked her to create a kind of a salon. It was I don't remember, it had an official name, the British Officers Entertainment Club or something like
cafe?
that. No, it wasn't a cafe. It was something that would be hosted at her place because they had a very nice place. And she and her friend Rose Gillinson, both of them very beautiful women, and the British aristocracy of Israel would show up and basically usually get drunk, pretty much. And my grandmother would just find out information that way, just through totally being absolutely charming. She was the first theater critic of the Jerusalem Post.
Your grandmother?
My grandmother, yeah. So she was very erudite, sure. Really well spoken, knew theater, knew culture. And then my grandfather, who was just this, who everybody adored, Dr. Davidowitz, and he could, because his knowledge of Shakespeare and Chaucer and anything in between and until today was great. So it was kind of like an ideal place. And Rose Gillinson, who is this very, very English lady, who I remember always used to wear roses or flowers in her hair and in her décolleté. Very, very lovely, urbane lady. So that's how that worked, that part of it. My grandfather, of course, had nothing to do with it other than come out of his library and wave to people and be cute.
Interesting. Where do your parents meet? Do you know where they met?
At the Aramona Hotel, at the cafe downstairs.
At that cafe downstairs?
At the Aramona Hotel, yeah.
That was the hotel in the building of?
Where it was on Hayarkon Street, since where the Machal people used to come there. You know where the American embassy is?
Sure.
I think, was. So it's either Trumpeldor or the one before it.
Okay.
It's one of those two.
The one before is...
near the French embassy, maybe.
Yeah, it's a little bit more north. Okay,
right, maybe near the French embassy.
Yeah, okay, gotcha.
Right there.
Okay.
On the corner.
Totally, I absolutely know. It's near Shalom Aleichem.
Yes,
yeah.
Could be, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
where the Dan Hotel is today.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Fascinating. And I see that there's a lot of pictures here also that I'm going to take some. Now, is your father mentioned in this book?
Yes.
Angels in the Sky?
Yes, both in Angels in the Sky and in the Pledge. Yeah. I love the Pledge. The Pledge is.
Can you just tell me briefly what the Pledge is about?
The Pledge is literally about the getting together the Air Force, actually creating an Air Force. So it's Leonard Slater, and it's the dedication. I mean, the front here is Joseph Heller. It's really about how they put together an Air Force out of nothing. So it's about the efforts, and it's all the efforts in the United States of America.
So Al Schwimmer's in here.
Yeah, sure. All of those people are in here. Yeah, I mean, you'll see a lot of the names that you know that appear also, some of them in Angels in the Sky. I happen to love it, I think, is because it's literally written like a captivating spy novel, but it's documentary, But that's true to the subject matter. I mean, that's really, when you think about it today, as my father said, the idiocy of thinking you could start a state in 1948, the absurd idea.
That's already absurd.
Yeah.
But for me, what's absurd in your father's story is that he's in a cafe, in a diner on the Upper West Side, and this guy just walks in. They were follling him. Apparently, they knew who he was.
They knew where he was. They knew what he was studying. They knew everything.
And he has no idea who they were.
No, but he impressed them, the guy. So
it's just like
crazy. Yeah, he was.
That meeting changed his life.
Changed his life, literally. Extraordinary. I mean, the idea of,
did you ever think about if that guy never would have approached your father?
Yeah, he would never. I mean, I don't know what my father would have been. I doubt he would have been an airline pilot. He probably would have ended up being a professor or something like that. That was his passion.
Did he get along with his in-laws?
Loved his in-laws. He worshipped my grandparents. For him, it was a kind of family he never knew. He came from a cold home, and to come to that warmth, to that totally embracing, open, passionate, and cultured. He loved that. My father was a more avid reader than my grandfather. My father was like, wow, brilliant. Knowledge of history, poetry, archaeology, deep. I mean, for him, they were literally like his adoptive parents. Gotcha. They were what he had always been looking for.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, Ida and Harry, for him, they were, I mean, when he spoke about them with reverence. He just adored them to pieces. He just loved them.
Now, also you told me, and this is just something, if we can, you told me you grew up in Sahala.
Yeah.
Any memories of people who lived there, like Rabin, you said, Shalom?
Oh, yeah. Sure. Well, Arik, I was friendly with, actually, which was really odd, because Arik's son, Guri Zichrono Livracha, was in my sister's class, in my sister Karen's class. I was on the kibbutz in Sarid when Guri was killed. But in Sahala, still when I was a kid, a couple of times Arik had invited me and a couple of other friends to come in. We were looking at, I don't remember, we were staring at something at them, and Arik just said, yeah, tikanfu. And I remember just him being so sweet and so nice, and you know, as a kid growing up in Israel, he was kind of like this mythological character. Sure. Later on, when I grew up, we became friendly. He came to shows that I did.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, it was the oddest thing. I was doing so it's Milchemet Yom Kippur, Gewalt, you know, and like just a disaster. So this is now January.
And you're already in the Miluim.
Yeah, I'm already in Miluim. Yeah. So now but we're still Meguyasim. So I'm like at that time, Egypt, like Sunday through Thursday, then Thursday fly back to Tel Aviv and do the Kabareta Politi Satiri in Tel Aviv against the government and the military on the weekend, which only in Israel. What was the name
of that show? That was...
I think a Kabareta Satiri. I can't remember what it was called. It was by Yonatan Geffen and Shlomo Gronich. Yeah. I did it with Galia Yishai, and I can't remember the third person.
So you're doing this on the weekends? Doing
it on the weekends, and Ari comes with Lili. So I go over before the show, I said, Ari, you know, I'm sorry, but anyway, we do the show, I come after the show, and I come up to him and say, נו אריק, מה דעתך אומר? זה לא מספיק חריף. So that was Arik. Yitzchak Rabin I remember well because it was in the neighborhood, and he just also because we had an incident. We picked on Dalia in school because there was a bunch of boys who were in love with her, so we were bothering the living hell out of her because we just loved her so much. We wanted her to notice us, which, you know, boys in 5th grade was really stupid. So one day, after we had picked on her, the door opens and in comes Aluf Yitzchak Rabin. And all the boys in class were going, oh my God, we're going to jail. This is the end.
He came into the classroom?
Into our classroom and said, Yeladim. And then in his inimicable, slow-paced word, just talked in general to the class about how to show affection and what it means when you like somebody or how you treat them and how to do, and that was it. And then he left. But that was to me classic Rabin. Never a trace of arrogance or any artifice. Plain, simple. But I also grew up with Tzvika Zamir, who was the head of the Mossad, because Dani was a good friend of mine in school. And Tzvika also, another example of one of those incredibly intelligent, special people who talk to you just face to face. I remember Dayan, because Dayan used to give us trempim to school. One day we had a party in Yad Eliyah. We were in high school, and my friend Rafi Ginei, who died unfortunately, comes in with Dayan. like, what's Dayan doing here? So Rafi said, no, so it wasn't high school, it was right after high school, because he was driving. His car broke down. Car breaks down on the road, suddenly a car pulls up. It's Dayan. So אתה צריך עזרה? No, Dayan, the בסדר. We said, no. What do you need? He said, well, I'm going to a party. איפה? He said, Yad Eliyahu. We said, good, I'll come too. I took him and came to the party. So memories like that. Ruth Dayan used to give us a lot of rides to school. Moti Hoda I didn't know really. But Ezer I knew because Ezer we'd see.
Because your father also.
Yeah, because of my father. And so I had opportunities quite a few times. And, so, but, I mean, it was, I remember, here's a memory. My friend Eyal Shacham, Zichrono Livracha, he was killed in Milchemet Yom Kippur. His father was an Aluf Mishneh in Tzahal, and his father was obviously working for other things than what his job title said. He was working in Ethiopia and in Kenya, and then one day we go over to visit Eyal. We're still in elementary school, and then there's this black gentleman there who's introduced to us as General Chainam, who was from the Mau Mau. And he's hiding in Sahala in the house of Aluf Mishneh Shacham. So these were like stories that you only, in Sahala could you have these, like sitting and listening to this general talking about his fight against the British, which, this is only, 20 years after the British had left Israel. So, when you think about it, recent history. And so,
crazy. Just
to see that, yeah. I remember going to visit Agron, because Agron, who was the mayor of Jerusalem, had also been the publisher of the editor of the Jerusalem Post, and he was my grandmother's high school boyfriend.
Okay.
So to see the Agronskis, we used to go visit them. I used to go visit Pesach Baradon, Ze'ev Vilnai, in the house in Jerusalem. A lot of memories like that of some wonderful Meyer Levin coming to visit, Louis Ginsburg, I think. I mean, very famous luminaries who would come to my grandparents' home and kind of make pilgrimage. And that was my growing up at that time, was in a place like that. Then I went to Kibbutz Sarid, was like a olam hafuch, from Tzahal, certainly. And I went there in 67 because I was just too young for Milchemet Sheshet Hayamim, and they needed mitnadvim. And so I said to my mother, I've got to go volunteer to help.
Where's
in the
Kibbutz Sarid exactly?
So it's Emek Yisrael, right underneath Migdal HaEmek and Natzeret.
Okay.
So it's literally on the lower slopes of the hill overlooking Emek Yisrael. It's the first time I fell in love with Eretz Yisrael was Kibbutz Sarid. That's where I really fell in love with Israel. It was awesome. It was really, and that's where I met my friend and my mentor Natan Yonatan, the poet, who just befriended me and took me under his wing. That's when I started writing music, was to Natan Yonatan's poetry. So I'll tell you a story that about 3 years ago, I get a phone call, and it's Ziv Yonatan, his younger son. Last time I'd seen Ziv, he was maybe 5 years old in the kibbutz. Wow! And his brother Lior was killed in Milchemet Yom Kippur. So Ziv is contacting me. They wanted to do a special memorial thing for his father. He wanted to know if I'd be interested in performing, and so I said, I'd love to. It didn't work out, whatever. But he said, you know what? Let me send you something. I've got something for you. And he sends me a recording of me at the age of 17, standing in Natan Yonatan's library, Chadar Avodah, in the kibbutz, singing him 2 pieces that I just composed for his poetry. I didn't remember the pieces, but just hearing Natan talk and hearing me there at 7, it was very emotional. So I immediately wrote a new piece for a Natan Yonatan poem that I loved and sent it to Ziv. Since then, Ziv and I have connected, and we were in Israel twice and met and talked, and we're talking about doing something together.
Perfect, Donnie. That was great. That was really good. I'm glad that we also got not only your father, but your mother and your grandfather, and your great grandfather, and I think that's good, and it's just important that their names are archived in the archive.
Yes,
it's just very, very, very important.
I mean, these are people who were. I mean, the stories I used to hear from my grandmother about Paula or about Vera Weitzman, I mean, the stuff that used to come out of Paula Ben-Gurion's mouth was like priceless. I mean, that woman had a tongue on her that was unreal. And I grew up also with Orit Ben Eliezer, that was Ben-Gurion's granddaughter.
I interviewed one of Ben-Gurion's bodyguards.
Oh, really?
2-3 years ago. And he just told us stories of how they would have to, go back to stores and return stuff that she stole and stuff like this, and like
wow,
just wow.
She was a real piece of work. She was funny. I remember when they had Dag Hammarskjöld over for dinner one night when he was still, the Secretary of the United Nations, and Wallace says to him, like out loud, so get married already and people will stop talking. That kind of stuff. Or when the Indian ambassador brought a baby elephant for Ben-Gurion, she said, Toda Rabba, Mar Ben-Gurion lo mekabel matanot sheochlot. So, she was... that was wonderful stuff. My grandmother was offered by Moshe Kol the second seat with the Miflaga Liberali for the first Knesset. And
she wasn't interested.
She said politics is not for a respectable human being. She didn't want to do it. In retrospect, I wish that more people like that would do.
Sure.
Because,
Sure.
but...
okay, I'm going to stop this camera now. I think, is there anything else?
I think so, yeah.